Hi all, this is day 13, Historical Archaeology. This should be a fairly short lecture because it's probably the field that is most well known to you all in terms of history and it being in the history books. Although historical archaeology, the goal is to rewrite history based on facts. So that is part of what we will talk about today. So Hall and Martin go out and excavate the Plymouth colony and the mission site in Quebec. And this is really an early excavation into figuring out if the historic record is true. So all of that narrative, the documents, all of those things, are they backed up by artifacts or material culture? And so this is an interesting kind of area. The Plymouth colony and Jamestown are two big stories in terms of our own creation story as Americans. So many times these areas are the first to be excavated to see if they're truthful, right? So the definition of historic archaeology is the study of human behavior through material remains whose interpretation is in some way affected by written history. So what's interesting about this is that written history, when you write it down, it becomes what's called canonized, where people believe it to be fact. The problem is that it has a lot to do with bias, who's actually writing that information down, and the story that they're trying to tell. For instance, historians who see everything in a positive light are going to gloss over the fact that Jamestown actually was struggling and had some major issues such as cannibalism involved. And those people with a more negative light are going to cast kind of doubt on that, but it needs to be backed up by an archaeological record. So again, I think the written history is one of these big areas where historical archaeology goes back and looks to make sure, again, through the archaeological record excavation, thorough analysis, to make sure that those written accounts are backed up by artifacts and or what they're finding in the archaeological record. And that's basically why we do it. And history, to a large degree, needs to have a correct story to be told. The goal, again, is to reduce bias, to eliminate those things out, and then validate data or invalidate the data or the historical record. Look for ambiguity, and noise between the historical records. So I say noise because different accounts have different variations on what happened. Which, to be honest, we can get lost in the so-called noise of that analysis. And I think archaeology, because it has this, processual or more scientific method structure than history does, it adds to more valid data, and it takes away from these ambiguities and or this so-called noise. The fascinating part here is, remember, when historians go out and do excavation or whatnot, or not excavation, sorry, when historians go out and look at the historical record, they are really looking at manuscripts, documents, so archives. They're not actually going out and doing archaeological data collection. So this is the key here. Historical Williamsburg, Jamestown, I think I've talked about Jamestown already in terms of cannibalism. So again, the historical record didn't really tell us much about cannibalism. And then when we start to do the excavations, we find that people actually were consuming dead friends and relatives in order to survive. This was more of a starvation cannibalism. This was not out of some weird, headhunting tradition or anything like that. This is simply survival, but we definitely have data of it. But remember, the historical record doesn't really talk about that much because it kind of throws off or skews our belief in that kind of American start or fairy tale, the Pocahontas story and some of those other things. Oops. Okay. Just make sure I'm on the right slide here. Sorry about that. Okay, so the law starts to change. In the 1960s and 70s, the federal government starts to legislate that archaeology must be done before construction projects are done. So this is a fascinating area where The law backs up the field, where again, before this, building roads and those kinds of things, there would have been no archaeological survey done. It would have just been bulldoze everything through, and not really care about the archaeological record, indigenous ancestor burials, those kinds of things. But when it becomes law, basically what you have is the creation of what's called cultural resource management firms. This is the archaeology that I did up in the Bay Area, which is, again, it's to mitigate the issues surrounding cultural heritage and the archaeological data and the developments, right? So it's to mitigate those things. So really, these are private firms operated by PhD archaeologists. And they basically go around to make sure that these, like for instance, this development here, you can see the archaeological team found an old wall, or building structure or foundation, and they're going to have to save that portion, I'm guessing, because this looks very historic. And so some of these substantial sites like this would actually be saved, and the developer would have to work around this according to cultural resource management laws. It's definitely an applied version of archaeology. To be honest, there's a lot of people hiring for this right now, especially in big times of development. When people are developing in, say, places like the Bay Area or Southern California, they have to call in an archaeologist or a cultural resource management firm to mitigate and to observe when the bulldozers kind of come in and the backhoes and those kinds of things, to make sure that there are no cultural heritage sites there. Historical archaeologists also study war battlefields. And this is the article that I've put out. It's kind of a new subfield that's emerging, which is called conflict archaeology. And really, it's a real focus on actual battle to make sure that, again, the historical record written by subjective human beings is actually accurate in their depiction of what actually happened during that battle. Let's see. One of the other kind of things that happens is now, instead of focusing on the large known sites, historical archaeologists are definitely focusing on disenfranchised groups. So plantations, slave houses would be included. The Caribbean's doing a lot of work in this area in terms of indentured servitude and that structure. Also, disenfranchised groups early on, right? So the workers, really, we're talking about workers in the lower classes, whereas it used to be all about doing historical archaeology on places like where George Washington had slept for the night or had a beer or something like that. Now it's moving into much more of, again, these disenfranchised groups that are of interest. And to be honest, it gives us a more textured history, right? And because even historians, sociologists, anthropologists have kind of gone back and looked at these disenfranchised groups, archaeologists now moving in this direction are trying to add to that narrative and that conversation based on artifacts and material culture. And again, the archaeological record backing through science up some of this history, or changing it, right, to possibly being her story. So again, there's some interesting things around these movements in this subfield. And again, they also look to shed light on issues found in history books and act as detectives trying to resolve disputes. So I've kind of touched on this. A lot of times archaeologists are maybe a historian's worst nightmare. Historians spend a lot of time in the archives looking at written data. And then archaeologists go out and actually study what these historians have put out, and they find that they're hugely inaccurate, and it's not necessarily their fault. Historians are just trained to utilize this kind of historic record, and they're not necessarily trained to go out in the field and do archaeology. So again, it's not to place blame here, but historical archaeologists are serving in this function of looking at history books and works to make, and then going out in the field and testing them to make sure that they're accurate. So one of the other things that they look for is hidden history, right? Again, I put on here African American archaeology. This is a real focus. This is Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's kind of mansion foundation home. The parts of it, these would be the slave buildings. And again, hidden history is looking at what wasn't told, right? Again, through the archaeological record, what can we kind of provide to the history, right? The story. of this era and this time. I mean, many times Thomas Jefferson is portrayed in this like this great light, right? And in reality, he had all of these other things going on, such as owning all of these slaves and even having a relationship with Sally Hemings. So again, how did the slaves live? So this is the other part, right? We know that Thomas Jefferson had slaves, but really the question becomes, how do they live, right? Like, can we figure out their food contents, how they cooked food, their daily life, their symbols, their jewelry, their rituals, right? How deep can we dive into the archaeological record to paint this holistic story of slaves and kind of their function within the Jeffersonian South, right? And again, how do they live daily is really the question, and this gets back to kind of the point earlier of really trying to figure out those people that have been underrepresented in history, because the victors usually tell that story, right? And usually it's in a positive light. To be honest, a lot of archaeology, especially with these sites that involve slaves, are going to produce a lot of evidence and work depicting kind of the opposite of that fairy tale story. It's going to turn out to be much more of a real account that is more real life and not kind of fairy tale like. And then there's recently, the New York City African burial ground, 1626 in the Dutch New Amsterdam area. So again, there's all of these things that they keep finding when they do these developments. New York's a major place for this, and really archaeologists are going out and trying to find, connect the dots. How is it that we connect this picture that's provided in history, or maybe isn't provided because it's left out? And then how do we add that and then give us more of a holistic, textured view of actually what happened? The Chinese railroad and Chinese labor during the railroad, the railroad camps. So some of these historic archaeologists are looking throughout the country, looking at these historic kind of Chinese railroad camps, and again, provide how they actually lived and how they survived. Another one that shows up on here is a lot of this has to do with migration. And how people moved, and then those real stories of interaction or conflict within those processes. Mormon communities show up here because Mormon communities, again, they're scattered from all the way from New York into Missouri and out to Utah, and there's a lot of interesting stuff that happens. Some of it being conflicts with Native Americans, where there were a few massacres, and again, archaeologists are going to go look at that data to find out actually the true history of it, so that it's not kind of doctored or changed. Correcting inaccuracies is the other big one, right? What happened at the Battle of Little Bighorn? This is Custer's last stand, and really, what we find out is major tactics by the Native Americans. It wasn't some lucky thing, and it wasn't that they were super outnumbered, the U.S. cavalry. It was much more kind of complicated than that. And interesting, to be honest. But again, historical archaeologists are going to look at all this data to check this, the accuracies of the history that's being told. And then one of the big things that happens is this just kind of the story that natives attacked all of the Americans that came west. And really what happens is the settlers that are moving out west are building permanent structures and blocking off land for cattle that are pushing natives off their land. And this really creates the conflict, right? And so the archaeologists are looking at how they can kind of correct this inaccuracy. They look for the types of weapons that are being used. So these would also be found in the archaeological record. This is actually a picture of the Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument. It does acknowledge all of the tribes involved. And then there's some other ones like archaeology in Annapolis, Maryland, backyard archaeology. Sometimes people find some amazing things in their backyard. And then, the medieval mindset shows up here, the culture of early pre-1660 AD British colonies that emphasize the group rather than the individual, conform to nature. So this is a fascinating one, looking at history and then balancing out, those stories of individualism, rugged individualism. Was that true in the 1660 time period? Actually, it was much more group-oriented than this individuality thing. So we start to see this movement towards individuality later on. The Gregorian order, we get the worldview, 1660, 1680 to 1820, arising out of the Age of Reason, believing that there's one order to the universe and the rise of scientific thought. So what we get during this time period is a change, right, into this kind of individualism and individuality, which is an interesting one. It moves into total changes in all across the board in terms of how we think and how we operate, and how we get archaeology and the scientific method.